Good day. My name is Lloyd Chabe, and today, grade 7s, we will be concluding relationship of the sun to the earth. So without any waste of time, let's begin. We are going to discuss solar energy and life on earth in detail, and we'll conclude with stored solar energy. By the end of this lesson, grade 7s, you're supposed to be able to explain how plants use light energy from the sun, explain how energy flows through the food chain, and describe the formation of fossil fuels. Now, here are scientific vocabulary that you are going to come across as we continue. The word photosynthesis, which is the process by which plants make their own food using carbon dioxide, water, and energy from the sun. We are going to come across carbohydrates. This is a type of food that plants manufacture. Examples are starch, glucose, and cellulose. A producer, this is an organism that uses sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide to manufacture its own food. Food chain, a food chain is a simple linkage of organisms. Herbivore, a herbivore is an animal that feeds only on producers or plants. Carnivores is an animal that only eats other animals. Omnivore is an animal that eats both plants and animals. And lastly, fossil fuels are sources of energy that are formed from the accumulated remains of living organisms that were buried millions of years ago. Now, for our introduction, now you're getting used to this picture of a close look of our sun. So let's continue, grade 7s. So far this term, you have learned about how the sun and earth interact to form day and night and the seasons. In this section, we are going to look further at how important the sun is for us on earth. In grade 6, you learned how plants produce food through the process of photosynthesis. We said plants absorb light energy from the sun and they use it to make food. In this way, the sun's energy is captured and stored so that it can be used later on. As we continue with our introduction, in photosynthesis, the energy from the sun is used to change carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrates, for example, cellulose, starch, or glucose. The carbohydrates are stored in fruits, leaves, wood, or bark. When we eat the plant, for example, an apple, our bodies are able to release the energy stored in them in carbohydrates. In the same way, animals, for example, a cow, uses the sun's energy when they eat the grass. Now, with that information, let's look at the following activity. Fill in the empty blocks to show the resources required for photosynthesis and the products that will be formed. Carbon dioxide and something here and another thing are needed for photosynthesis to take place. And the product that will be formed is oxygen and what? Take a minute, grade 7, and think of two words that are needed up there and one that is needed below. Okay, let's move to the answers. For photosynthesis to take place, you need carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. And your products will be oxygen and glucose or food. I hope you got them right, grade 7s. Now, let's continue. Question number 1. Where does the plant get the following? Where does the plant get water? Where does the plant get carbon dioxide? And where does the plant get energy? Take time and pause the video to answer the following question. Where does the plant get water, carbon dioxide, and energy? Okay, grade 7s, your answer for where does the plant get the following, which is water, the plant gets water from the soil. And then from the question, where does the plant get carbon dioxide, your answer should have been the plant gets carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Where does the plant get energy? The plant gets energy from the sun. I hope you got all of them correct. Now, here is one more question. Give one example of a carbohydrate. We have mentioned them above, grade 7. Mention only one. The answer, glucose, or starch, or cellulose. If you mention any of these three, grade 7s, you are correct. Now, let's move to another objective of our lesson, which is energy flow in a food chain. Energy flow in a food chain. So, to begin this section, let's watch a video.
All living things need energy in order to live, and they get this energy from the food they eat. All food chains start with plants and end with animals. Plants are called producers because they produce their own food from sunlight, water, and the nutrition that they get from the soil. Animals are called consumers because they cannot prepare their own food and are directly or indirectly dependent on plants for their energy. Some animals eat plants and some eat animals for energy. Animals that eat only plants to get energy are called herbivores. For example, deers, cows, grasshoppers. Animals that eat only animals to get energy are called carnivores. For example, tigers, lions, snakes. Animals that eat both plants and animals to get energy are called omnivores. For example, monkeys and bears. A simple food chain starts with grass, which is eaten by rabbits. Then the rabbits are eaten by foxes. A big food chain starts with acorns, which are eaten by mice. The mice are eaten by snakes. And then finally the snakes are eaten by hawks. At each link in the chain, energy is being transferred from one animal to another. Marine food chain. A marine food chain starts with phytoplankton, which are eaten by small fishes. Then the small fishes are eaten by medium-sized fishes. And at last, the medium-sized fishes are eaten by big fishes. food web. The arrows in a food chain show the flow of energy. A network of many food chains is called a food web.
Okay, grade 7s, I hope you enjoyed the video. Now, let's go back to our presentation. Now, plants and animals depend on the sun for energy. Plants need the sun's energy to manufacture food, and this food is eaten by animals. These animals are then eaten by other animals. These animals are then eaten by other animals, and this is called a food chain. Let's repeat our bullets. Plants and animals depend on the sun for energy. Plants need the sun's energy to manufacture food, and this food is eaten by animals. These animals are then eaten by other animals, and we call this food chain. A food chain is a simple linkage of organisms. It begins with a producer, which is eaten by a herbivore or an omnivore, which in turn will be eaten by a carnivore. Let's discuss an example. When a bird eats an insect and a snake eats the bird, these organisms are all linked in a food chain. Now, grade 7s, let's go for an activity. The following organisms are in an environment, so you should picture this. We have a frog, a grasshopper, a plant, and a snake. So our first question, draw a food chain to show the energy flow from one organism to the next. Draw a food chain to show the energy flow from one organism to the next. Question number 2, please label which one is the producer, which one is a herbivore, omnivore, and carnivore. Question number 3, what would happen if the earth did not receive any sunshine? What would happen if the earth did not receive any sunshine? And last question, grade 7s. What will happen if all the frogs were removed from this area? Please pause the video and answer the following questions. Now let's discuss the answers. For question number 1, on where we asked you to draw a food chain to show the energy flow from one organism to the next, this is what you should have drawn. First the plant, grasshopper, frog, and lastly snake. Your answer for number 2, the question was, please label the following as a producer, herbivore, omnivore, and lastly carnivore. So you are correct when you say plant, it's a producer, a grasshopper is herbivore, frog, omnivore, and snake, carnivore. For our third question, remember the question said, what would happen if the earth did not receive any sunshine? If the earth did not receive sunlight, the earth would freeze. Plants would not be able to produce food. The water cycle would not occur, so no rainfall. Let us repeat that. What would happen if the earth did not receive any sunshine? Your answer should have some of these terms of the fact that if the earth did not receive sunlight, the earth would freeze. Plants would not be able to produce food. The water cycle will not occur. Therefore, we won't be having rainfall. The last question, which was, what would happen if all the frogs were removed from this area? Your answer should be around the lines of, frogs feed on grasshoppers. The population of the grasshoppers would increase to huge numbers and may destroy the plants or eat too many of the plants. The snake feed on frogs and they would have very little food and they would die out. This ecosystem will ultimately be destroyed if all the frogs were removed. I hope you got it, grade 7s. Now, that is the end of that part of our topic. Now, let's elaborate more on how water is recycled. Point number 1. Plants also need water now to photosynthesize. Water is not made on earth, but is recycled. The heat from the sun causes the water to evaporate. This water then cools to form tiny droplets of water, which eventually forms clouds. Rain then falls from the clouds onto the earth. Now, let's look at this picture, which shows it much better. It starts there. Sun's energy warms the earth and water evaporates. The water cools to form tiny droplets of water. The clouds are formed. Rain falls from the clouds onto the earth, filling up our rivers, dams, oceans, and lakes. So the cycle will continue like that. As long as there is sunshine or sunrise, the sun's energy will warm the earth and water will still evaporate. The water will cool down to form tiny droplets. Clouds will be formed. Rain fall from the clouds onto the earth, and rivers, dams, ocean, and lakes filled or formed. Now the cycle will continue until, that is why it is named the water cycle. So grade 7, that is a conclusion of that section as well. Now we are moving to fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are sources of energy that formed from the accumulated remains of living organisms that were buried millions of years ago. Coal, crude oil, and natural gas are examples of fossil fuels. Coal, natural gas, and oil are examples of fossil fuels. Now, let's discuss the formation of coal. Let's discuss the formation of coal. Millions of years ago, the earth was covered with fern-like plants. The earth changed and the land was covered by water, forming swamps. Over time, the plants died, forming a thick layer of dead vegetation at the bottom of the swamps. As more water covered the land, sand and silt, which is a fine sand or clay, were washed in and covered the dead vegetation, helping more and more plants to grow. This process repeated itself for millions of years, building up massive layers of dead plant materials called peat. The peat layers eventually became buried and compressed even more Pressure and heat caused peat to turn into lignite, or porous type of coal. After more pressure and heat, more moisture was squeezed out of the lignite until it became soft. Bituminous coal and eventually anthracite, the hardest type of coal. So now, let's watch a video so that we can have a picture of the formation of coal.
Hi, I'm Kirsten. Welcome to Real World Science.
Coal is a solid, black,
In this program,
readily
we are going to
combustible
travel the
fossil
world
fuel
and
that
discover
contains a
all about
large
the many
amount
different
of
places
carbon-based
where
material.
animals and plants live.
The formation of coal takes a few million
Ready?
years.
Let's
The
go.
first coal-bearing rock units appeared around 290 to 360 million years ago during the Carboniferous or coal-bearing period. The formation of
Please rewind and watch it again. Please be attentive.
How is coal formed? Coal is a solid, black, readily combustible fossil fuel that contains a large amount of carbon-based material. The formation of coal takes a few million years. The first coal-bearing rock units appeared around 290 to 360 million years ago during the Carboniferous or coal-bearing period. The formation of coal begins in areas of swampy wetlands where groundwater is near or slightly above the topsoil. Because of this, the flora present produces organic matter at a faster rate than it can be decomposed. As a result, the layers of organic matter are accumulated and then buried, which eventually forms coal. There are two main phases in coal formation, which is known as petrification due to bacterial activity and coalification due to increase in temperature and pressure due to burial of organic matter. The plant matter, which includes ferns, shrubs, vines, trees, and algae, dies and accumulates on the surface. Initially, the organic matter is decomposed by bacteria yielding carbon dioxide and methane. The plant matter becomes buried and are no longer exposed to air. Anaerobic bacteria then starts to decompose the material. Burial and accumulation occurs for thousands of years to form several meters of partially decayed plant matter, which is known as peat. When this peat is deeply buried, water and other compounds is squeezed out from the increasing pressure, and the lowest quality of coal or lignite begins to form. Continued burial, resulting in increasing pressures and temperatures, causes this low quality lignite coal to be transformed into higher quality black coals. First, lignite becomes subbituminous coal, then bituminous coal, and finally the highest quality, which is known as anthracite coal. As these transformations occur, the amount of water and other compounds in the coal decreases and the coal becomes more dense with a higher carbon concentration.
Okay, grade 7s. Now let's summarize the formation of coal. Firstly, plants in swamps die, covered by sand and silt. Many layers form repeatedly and peat is formed. After time, pressure and heat, lignite is formed. And after time, pressure and heating, moisture was squeezed out of the lignite until it became soft. Bituminous coal and eventually anthracite, the hardest type of coal, will be now available. So this is a summary of the formation of coal. Now, let's continue. Now let's discuss formation of crude oil and natural gas and look for the similarities of the formation of coal and formation of crude oil and natural gas. Let's begin. Oil, also known as crude oil, and natural gas were also formed millions of years ago by processes similar to those leading to the formation of coal. Sea animals and plants died in the ocean and were deposited on the ocean floor. Over millions of years, layer upon layer of marine deposit formed and were covered by sand and silt. Let's repeat that. Over millions of years, layer upon layer of marine deposits were formed and were covered by sand and silt. Now, temperature and pressure cause the deposits to change into crude oil and natural gas. Today, oil and gas are trapped under layers of rocks and sediment and have to be drilled and pumped out of the earth. South Africa has fields off the coast of Mossel Bay, but we do not have only oil reserves. So South Africa has some gas fields off the coast of Mossel Bay, but we do not have any oil reserves. Now, for crude oil is refined to make many different products such as motor oil, petrol, diesel, and tar, Vaseline, and other waxes. With this information, grade 7s, let's watch a video so that we can have a picture of what we are talking about.
In today's video, we're going to be looking into crude oil, and we'll also look into the steps by which a crude oil is formed. It's a very important topic if you're taking GCSE chemistry. You will be asked a lengthy question. It usually comes as a 6 marker, whereby you'll have to give the steps explaining how crude oil is formed. So I'm going to go over some of the steps here. So the first thing that happens that results in the formation of crude oil is that the plant and animals die and they sink to the bottom of the sea. And so we've got lots of plankton, sea creatures that cannot swim against a current, and this includes algae, bacteria, and some other animals. So these are small animals, they die and they sink to the bottom of the sea. So that's the first step. And so crude oil is ultimately obtained from these microscopic plants and animals. So the first step is they have to die and they sink to the bottom of the sea. And what happens over time is that these plants and animals that are now dead, they get buried under layers of sediments. Now, sediments could be mud. So literally mud particles deposit on top, and it takes years and years for the layers to be formed. So you get layers of sediment, and because the layers are building up, the layers will exert pressure. Now it's very important to note here that you've got a huge amount of pressure being built up, but also heat. So there is that high temperature quite deep underneath the earth surface, underneath the sea, and then you've also got absence of oxygen. So under these three conditions, so you've got high pressure, temperature, and absence of oxygen. These are the three conditions that are needed, and because of these three conditions, that the dead plants and animals get converted into crude oil. Once the crude oil is formed, the oil will then rise up through the permeable rocks. Now, permeable means porous, so which will allow the liquid and gas to climb up. So the oil and gas will climb up till it gets trapped and it can't come up anymore. So if it's trapped by impermeable rocks, then that's the journey of the crude oil finished. So you will only get crude oil movement till there, then it can't go anywhere higher. So eventually the oil will move up. So that's the step 4. So step 1, we've looked into that the microscopic plants and animals die, they get buried under layers and layers of sediment. And the 3 factors, very important, is high pressure, temperature, and absence of oxygen. Under these 3 conditions, the dead plants and animals get converted into crude oil. And over years, it takes billions of years before the crude oil is formed and it slowly rises up. So the question is, how do we know where this crude oil is located? Because it's happened over billions of years. So there are a variety of methods by which if the presence of crude oil is detected, and this particular image gives you an idea of one of the techniques that's used. And once the crude oil location is detected, it's determined whether it's economical enough to go ahead and mine the oil from that location. And once it has all been assessed, then what it ultimately leads to is some kind of a rig being set up to extract the oil. So you've got to drill through the rock. Now remember, the crude oil is underneath the impermeable rocks, and therefore you have to drill through the rocks in order to get to the crude oil, and then the oil has to be brought up to the surface. So overall in this video, we're only gonna study about how crude oil is formed, and I've just given you some idea about how it's detected and how you can extract it. In the next video, we will be looking into what happens next. So remember, you've got crude oil, but so what? What do we do next with it? So overall in this video, we've looked into that crude oil is a finite resource. Now this is another GCSE question that comes up. What is the meaning of finite resource? Finite means something that it will run out. So that's your finite resource. And a very short definition or explanation of crude oil. Crude oil is formed from the remains of ancient biomass consisting mainly of plankton that was buried in the mud. But remember, it takes billions of years. 3 steps, 3 points to remember: high temperature, high pressure, and absence of oxygen. Okay, so I'll see you at the next video where I'm going to explain about what happens next. So you've got crude oil, what do we do next with it?
The video. Now let's summarize. Now, oil formation, we started by saying the sea plants and plants died in the oceans and were deposited on the ocean floor. Layer upon layer of marine deposit formed and were covered by sand and silt. Temperature and pressure caused deposit to change into crude oil. Oil trapped under layers of rocks and sediment and have to be drilled and pumped out of the earth. Now, this is formation of oil, which is similar to the formation of gas. We also say sea animals and plants died in the ocean and were deposited on the ocean floor. Layer upon layer of marine deposit formed and were covered by sand and silt. Temperature and pressure caused deposit to change into natural gas. And lastly, oil or gas trapped under layers of rocks and sediment have to be drilled and pumped out of the earth. Now, grade 7s, with that information, let's tackle the last activity of the day. Here are our questions. Question number 1. What are fossil fuels? What conditions are needed for fossil fuels to form? Why are fossil fuels important? And lastly, why can't we make fossil fuels today? So grade 7s, please pause the video and answer the activity. For our answers, for question number 1, which says, what are fossil fuels? Fossil fuels are sources of energy that formed from the accumulated remains of living organisms that were buried millions of years ago. Question number 2, what conditions are needed for fossil fuels to form? You need pressure, heat, and time. Why are fossil fuels important? Burning fossil fuels releases energy. Crude oil is refined to make many different products such as motor oil, petrol, diesel and tar, Vaseline, and other waxes. Gas and coal can be burned to release energy for many activities like cooking, heating, and light. The last question, why can't we make fossil fuels today? Because they take millions of years to form. Now, the last part of our lesson will be the advantages and disadvantages of using fossil fuels. Let's look at them. Let's start with our advantages. They are the cheapest source of energy. They are safe to transport. Economic benefits are countries that produce oil and gas are richer than those that don't, and they also create jobs. They are very stable and easy to store. A little amount produces a lot of energy. Now, the disadvantages? They destroy the environment because when they burn, carbon dioxide is released into the environment, and this causes global warming, which means the Earth's temperature increases. They also cause pollution, which leads to people getting diseases such as lung cancer or asthma. And once they are finished, we cannot make them again. So we name them non-renewable energy sources. Number 4, health of coal mine workers is deteriorating. And the last one, if there is an oil spill in the ocean sea, animals will die, and the land animals that rely on these animals for food will also die. So these are the advantages and disadvantages of using fossil fuels. Grade 7, as we conclude, remember our objectives were to explain how plants make use of light energy from the sun, explain how energy flows through the food chain, describe the formation of fossil fuels. I hope we have achieved all our objectives. So grade 7s, until we meet again, thank you and goodbye.